So I'd like to welcome Ben Souffriau, I hope I said that right.
Yeah.
Close enough. From AB Biotek. So Ben has more than 15 years experience in research and development and practical yeast and fermentation experience. He's got a PhD in bioengineering sciences from laboratory and malting and brewing. I'll start again. Bioengineering sciences from Laboratory of Malting and Brewing Science and Laboratory of Molecular Cell Biology, KU Leuven. Perfect. And spent 6 years as a global yeast and fermentation specialist and product innovation specialist at AB InBev. Now with AB Biotek, his passion is in bringing value to the industry through science and technology. And today, Ben's going to talk to us about how to make your good beer great, which is actually a really good follow-on for you guys that attended Richard's presentation before lunch. So I'm looking forward to learning about this. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining this talk. So I would like to talk to you a little bit today about how to improve beer flavor profile with yeast, because I'm working in a yeast company. But let me first explain a little bit before moving into the topic, like who we are, because I think most people don't know us yet. We're a new supplier for brewing. So I'm here with my two colleagues, with Anthony, who is the General Manager for AB Biotek, Asia Pacific and South Africa, and Tina Tran, who is a Commercial Director for Asia Pacific. So I myself look for application and product development for yeast and other ingredients for brewing. And I'm based in the Netherlands, but I'm actually Belgian. So the Netherlands and Belgium is quite close together, so that's why. So let me explain to you a little bit what we do, then very short, and then immediately move to how to optimize your flavor profile, and closing off with how to do that also for sour beer, because there we have a new product that we're also launching in this event. Okay. So our company is named AB Biotek. So we're a company specialized in fermentation in several divisions. So we do beer, wine, distilled spirits, biofuels, human nutrition, animal nutrition. And we like to call ourselves science and technology driven, because science and technology is very important to bring good products. And we sell our brands under our yeast under the name Pinnacle. So just so you know, we also have a booth here. And important for you guys to know, we have a presence in Australia. So I myself work in the Netherlands, where we have our application center. But in Sydney, we actually have our R&D center, where we do all the yeast drying. And yeast drying, it may sound easy, but it's not so easy. A lot of the quality of your yeast depends on how it is dried. Because imagine we take someone of the audience, we dry you out, put you in a package, close it, and a few months later we open it, put some water, and it will not be so simple to get you alive again. And the same is true for yeast. So it needs to be done in the right way. We also had a factory in Australia. However, this factory will now be integrated in the new plant in Hull, which is a brand new plant for dried yeast. And we have our an R&D lab for strain development in US, where we can make new yeast that has never been, that does not exist yet. So our products, I don't want to make it advertisement, but just quickly so you know, we have American ale, we have an English ale, and we have a Pilsner. And I will talk a little bit more about the two first, American ale and English ale, just because we use them to explore how you can optimize flavor profile. So this is what I just mentioned. Our American ale is a Chico type yeast, so West Coast IPA yeast. And it's very clean in aroma, while the English ale is a little bit more fruity. And the Pilsner, I will not talk about today, because that's not part of this talk. Okay, so from good to great beer, what do I mean with that? And why do you need to try to optimize your flavor? So we all know that nice packaging of your beer, it attracts consumers to buy the beer the first time. But if you want them to keep buying it, your flavor needs to be perfect. And that's also what makes brands last and what makes brands popular is when yeast delivers to your beer a constant quality. So when your flavor profile is there, is good all the time, that's when you can build good brands. So many brewers, they know hops, they know brewing, but yeast is a little bit more mysterious. So it's sometimes a little bit more a black box, and we don't always know well how to influence it. So we want to help you by giving tools to make better beer and to improve fermentation practice. So first thing, I think you all know that beer has a lot of flavors, more than 600 in total, and that's more than any other beverages, more than wine, more than distilled spirits. So beer is very, very complex. So we do not only have the alcohols, like the fusel alcohols and ethanol, of course, but we also have the fruity esters that are very important. We have the sulfurs that are often not really desired. We have the flavors that come from interaction of hops and yeast. I think of those nice citrus and tropical flavors. It's all yeast and hop interaction. And then we have other flavors like clove, like a Weiss or a Belgian beer. Diacetyl, which we like to avoid as much as possible, or vinegar. So we have numerous flavors, but today I mostly would like to focus on the esters, because we know that actually, depending on the beer style, 20 to 50% of the flavor signature of the beer comes from the esters. So in maybe a heavily hopped IPA, it might be 20%, but in other styles like a Belgian, it could be 50% or even more of the flavor that is determined by the esters. And in this group of esters, we have several ones. We have isomyl acetate, which gives you banana pear-like aroma. We have ethyl acetate, which is more solvent. Fruity, we have ethyl butyrate, tropical fruit, and then we have hexanoate, red apple, and there are even some others that are not esters, but still have that fruity flavor. And in this group, isomyl acetate accounts for about 50% of the flavor contribution. So that's, let's say, like one of the markers of fruitiness in beer is isomyl acetate. And why is it a marker? Because most of the other flavors, they just follow the same trend. If isomyl acetate is up, the others will also be up in most cases. So this, it's not very difficult to uncouple the esters from each other. Ethyl acetate, definitely also important flavor compound. So even though I say that the flavor is banana and pear, it doesn't mean that it tastes like a banana. It just, in low concentrations, it will just come out as fruity. In high concentrations, it will be more banana. And if it's even higher, it might be pear. And it depends on each person how you perceive it. And fermentation process has a very high impact on the intensity of these compounds. And just to give you an idea for isomyl acetate, a typical lager would be below 1 milligram per liter in isomyl acetate. So a typical lager, as you have also some here in Australia, definitely. But then you have lagers that are much more intense, like a Heineken is an example, or a Budweiser will be up to 3 ppm of isomyl acetate. And then Weiss beer or Belgian styles can be up to 8 or maybe even 10 ppm. Now, how can we actually optimize or change the flavor profile of beer? There is several ways, and I like to describe it as a triangle. So the flavor profile depends on yeast strain, raw materials, and brewing process. So what can you do? You can change the yeast strain, of course. That's one way. There is a very big variety in yeast strains. Some produce almost nothing, and some produce very high amounts of esters. However, mostly you just want to give that extra touch. You just don't want to change your yeast because you're used to working with it. So we look also at other options. So raw materials. Some parameters you can change about raw materials. It's rather easy, like zinc or nutrients you can add, but other parameters are actually not so easy. You cannot just double the gravity to have more esters because then you also double the alcohol. You cannot so easily add more lipids or increase the free amino nitrogen. So this is also rather difficult in the end to do. But what is more easy is your brewing process. So temperature, aeration, pitching rate, the tank geometry, yeast recovery, all of that has also a very big impact. Now, what is the most practical thing to do is temperature, aeration, and pitching rate. I would say that those are easy tools that every brewer can use to change the flavor profile. And there's a lot known in literature. Sorry, can you go back one slide maybe? Yeah. So there's a lot known in literature on how these parameters affect the esters. So the esters and the higher alcohols, both of them. However, every yeast is different. So these are general tools that work on many yeast, but still every yeast can behave slightly different. And that's why we did some tests with our yeast to see how actually they behave in different conditions. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have one yeast, American ale, which is a Californian ale. And what we found when we checked isomyl acetate and ethyl acetate and isomyl alcohol, in these different conditions, which would be a normal pitching, 60 gram per hectoliter, under pitching, 30 gram per hectoliter, and then 18 degrees, 25 degrees, and aeration or no aeration, what we saw is that this yeast is a yeast that actually performs the same whatever you do. And maybe you know the yeast, because many of you are using a similar yeast, can be from another brand. But this is known as a very clean yeast that in every condition will be clean and therefore is ideal for malt and hop-driven beers. However, the other yeast, the English ale, is much different. Why? Because it's much more tunable and it's also much more fruity. So here you see the fruitiness level is around 3 to 4, or like 2.5 to 4.5, and this is almost the double than this. while this will be slightly fruity, this will be quite intense fruity. Also in the fusels, the isomeal alcohol as a marker, you can see that there is a big range with this yeast. And this offers an opportunity to improve flavor profile, depending on the style that you want to make. And so typically the more fruity it comes out, also the less malty it will be. Also fruity esters from the yeast, they enhance the fruity flavors from the hops. So that can turn out very nice in New England IPA, for instance. We've also looked at fermentation kinetics, for instance, for our American ale yeast. There we found that actually, as expected, yeast ferments much faster at 25 degrees. And therefore, our recommendation to use such a yeast is to ferment it rather a little bit higher in temperature, because it doesn't impact the flavor profile, but it still gives you a faster fermentation. So any beer made with a yeast like this, Californian ale, we recommend to ferment at a little bit higher temperature and use a normal pitching rate. But then to come to our English ale, there we see that with one and the same yeast, since it's so diverse, depending on the conditions, you can make different type of beers. It can be a clean, rather clean ale, it can be a fruity ale, or it can be intense fruity and even a little bit solvent, like a barley wine. So that's, and then how in practice do we need to do that? So here, we measured those flavor compounds in every condition. It's duplicates. Sorry, no, it's not duplicates, but it's aerated and non-aerated. 60 gram per hectoliter, 30 gram per hectoliter, 18 and 25 degrees. And the conclusion is basically if you want with this type of yeast a fruity pale ale or a New England IPA profile, just ferment it at lower temperature, at lower pitching, and no aeration. So those three parameters are the best conditions to have it as fruity as possible. Low higher alcohols, low solvent, but high fruity esters. Right. So, and this is a little bit in contrast with what you would find in literature, that higher temperature gives you more esters. That higher temperature indeed gives you more esters. In this case, it was actually the other way around. Then if you would like to make a more heavy beer, like a barley wine or an Abbey style, but then not non-phenolic, where higher alcohols or a little bit more solventy esters are preferred, then the recommendation is rather to ferment it higher temperature and higher pitching. Right. And this is kind of the summary of what I just mentioned. With this yeast, there is obviously a difference in fermentation time. 25 degrees will ferment much faster than 18, but still, I think more important is to have the right flavor, low pitch and low temperature, more fruity, and high pitch and high temperature. Gives you, I think this is a mistake, gives you a more like barley wine type profile. Okay, then you also have the more phenolic yeast, so yeast that is used to make Weiss or barley wine. There, I don't have really laboratory data, but we have quite some data from brewers that have tested it in different conditions. And in our portfolio range, we have next to the Pinnacle yeast, we also have the brewhouse yeast, which where we have a lager, an ale, and a Weiss. And it's about this Weiss I would like to explain a little bit more in detail how you can also tune phenolic flavors. And as you may know, you have different type of phenolic beer styles, and if you plot them along the axis of fruitiness, esters, and phenols, then you will see that the German Hefeweizen and the Weizenbock, they're the most intense. Belgian ale typically will be very fruity, but a little bit less clovey. Belgian wit and spice beer will be somewhere in the middle, and then you have American wheat, which is low on the two axes. So how can you, with one yeast again, try to approach all the styles just by modifying your fermentation process, fermentation and brewing process actually? So first thing is the phenols. So phenolic flavor, so that's the clove and vanilla-like flavor, is produced by the yeast. So it's produced by yeast that converts ferulic acid, which comes from the malt, into 4-vinyl guaiacol. So, and mostly the yeast has the property, or it does not have it. And if it has the property, there are some gradations in some yeast being able to make this reaction to a high extent and some to a lower extent. Now, the way how to create a lot of this 4-vinyl guaiacol, the clovey flavor, is by introducing a mashing step at 45 degrees for 30 to 60 minutes. Because during this mashing step, the ferulic acid is released by enzymes in the malt. So the longer you keep the mashing step, the more you will move on this axis. And the shorter is the less ferulic acid that you will have. It's also mentioned often that including wheat malt would increase the ferulic acid, but research has shown that actually it is not the case. It's a myth. So whether you add 10, 20, 30, 40% of wheat malt, it won't make a difference for ferulic acid. It's really more the mashing step that makes it. And then how to make sure you get higher in the esters. So there, the best way is to pitch a little bit lower, not too low, never go below 30 grams per hectoliter. In this case, a higher temperature works well to have higher esters, and no aeration. Also know that for dried yeast, actually aeration is never needed. But in some cases, it helps a little bit to tune the flavor profile. And also, if you want to recover yeast, then you need to aerate. That's a different case. But for one-time use, you don't need to aerate. So okay, so then it means you want to be in this part of the diagram. Just do the mashing 45 degrees and apply one or two of those parameters. Okay, and then the last part of the talk is about sour beer. So since I'm from Belgium, I like sour beer. So in Belgium we have a quite old tradition for lambic and geuze. And the yeast that we have developed links into that. So sour beer, it's a growing trend in the latest years. You see a lot in US. You see a lot also in Brazil, for instance. And now I learned that actually also in Australia it's quite a trend. So it originates from the traditional styles like Berliner Weiss or Lambic, Geuze. But today it's transformed in more accessible styles like sour IPA, for instance. Often it's also combined with fruit infusions, sugar additions, and it provides an opportunity for brewers to diversify outside of the pure beer, and sometimes it's a taste that appeals to more people. So the yeast that we have developed for this is called Pinnacle Crisp Sour. And actually, it's a Lachantia thermotolerance. So what's so special about this yeast? It's a yeast that makes lactic acid. And lactic acid obviously gives a sour taste. But at the same time, it produces alcohol. Then the combination of that gives you the opportunity to produce a sour flavor in fermentation. While often brewers use today kettle sour with bacteria to sour the beer in the brew house. This is not needed anymore for this product, so you avoid this 1 or 2 days that your brew house is occupied with the kettle sour. You avoid that, and you can just make the souring in fermentation like any regular yeast. You also avoid bacterial contamination concerns and also oxidation, because as you may know, kettle sour, if your wort is there like 1 or 2 days at 35, close to 40 degrees, you get oxidation reactions. And some brewers try to mitigate this by putting a CO2 blanket, which helps to some extent, but is never 100%. So this solution definitely helps to avoid that. And it results in a very nice and smooth acidity in 6 to 9 days of fermentation. And so we tested our yeast with like 10 professional brewers, tasters, in a panel. We compared it to a competitor product, and actually many of the tasters liked our product. And as you can see, this is blind tasting. As you can see, it's different from existing products in a way that it's more fruity, and also it has a very nice tropical edge to it. And we think that this goes very, very nicely together with fruit infusion, for instance, and it's very complementary. So about organic acids, what you need to know is that so any bacteria or any yeast always makes a little bit of acetic acid. So it's the balance between those two acids, between lactic and acetic acid, that gives you a certain flavor profile. And here I put for some well-known beer styles the ranges of lactic and acetic acid that you can find back in those beers. And what you will see is that most of the sour beers, they will be somewhere in the range between 1 to 4 grams per liter of lactic acid. And then acetic acid also occurs in almost all of them in a range, let's say, below 0.5 grams per liter, except for the Belgian lambic and geuze. Their acetic acid is really part of the flavor profile, and this makes a lambic or a geuze. What is so typical about this style is that it has this very sharp acidity, which is a bit vinegar-like. Sometimes it can be quite harsh even. While lactic acid is more smooth, it's more fresh. So actually, most of the modern styles, they would rather have a little bit more lactic acid and acetic acid close to the flavor thresholds or even below. So then if you compare our yeast, the Pinnacle Crisp Sour, with what you can get typically from a kettle sour and what you find in those beer styles, then we see that we are in the same range. I think for lactic acid, we're just a little bit lower, which makes it very mild sour, very accessible for acetic acid and overall pH. We are in the same range. Now there are still ways to tune this and to make it more or less sour, more or less acetic acid and lactic acid. And so we've looked at some fermentation parameters and also recipe parameters just to see what impact this has on the flavor of the beer and those acids being produced. So the data we obtained for a 12-Plato wort with a starting pH of 5.5. And then what we tried is we had so the full malt. The first one is I-rated wort, so full malt I-rated. Then the next one is full malt with a direct pitch without aeration. And then since we've seen for other products that addition of glucose has an impact, we also tried this for Pinnacle Crisp Sour, so 10% glucose, 15 and 20% glucose. And I think this graph shows it pretty well. So it shows that probably if you want a good, clearly noticeable acidity, that actually aeration helps. So while normally aeration not needed for dried yeast, here it actually has a benefit. So the more you aerate, the more lactic acid you create. And this is because lactic acid the production is dependent on the redox balance of the yeast. So it is no surprise in a way that aeration can have an impact there. Full malt has like the second highest lactic acid concentration, but also results in some acetic acid. So there will be a little bit sharper acidity. Depending on the style, it can be desired or not. And then when you start to add glucose, the more glucose you add, the more the acids drop. So both the lactic acid drops as the acetic acid. So addition of glucose, actually I would not really recommend to do it because I think that this is really a better condition to produce a good sour. But if you want a really very smooth sour, then addition of glucose can help. So just in a nutshell on the yeast, like how to make a sour with this yeast. So you start with regular wort, you aerate well. Optionally, you can adjust the pH to somewhere 5.2. If you don't do any pH adjustment, you will be around 5.5, I assume. It will still work. We have seen cases where acidification happens to a pH of 3.3, which is definitely nice acidic, even with a 5.5. But if you do some pre-adjustment, I think you have a higher chance of success to get the pH low enough. Pitching, 50 gram per hectoliter, but 100 gram per hectoliter will give a faster fermentation. And this is for a wort below 12 Plato, I would say. If you want to go higher density wort, better pitch at least 100 or even higher. If you want to go very high alcohol, for instance, like 10 ABV, then it will not work with this yeast alone. Then you need to co-inoculate first the Lachantia and then a different yeast. Fermentation can happen in a wide range, 18 to 30 degrees, but a good spot is around 22 to 25 degrees. And then two things to take into account. So extract reduction. We found that in some cases it shows like a biphasic pattern. So if you start at 12 Plato, you get the first phase going to 8 Plato, and then it looks like the fermentation is like done or stuck, but it's not. It's not. It just needs a little bit time to adapt the metabolism, because what we see is that the pH drop happens in the first day. So that's where you get almost all the lactic acid produced. And then the yeast probably switch its metabolism and start to make no lactic acid anymore, but just alcohol. And maybe this is where the yeast might need some adaptation. So it can take a few days here before it starts and finishes off the fermentation. And then when it comes to the end of the fermentation, there also something to keep in mind is that so this yeast produce lactic acid to some extent, and during the production of lactic acid you don't have CO2 release. So because of that, your apparent extract will not drop so deep, because the CO2 leaves your beer, and this way reduces the density. But this is not the case, because we have all the carbon in lactic acids. So therefore, final density for a 12 Plato will be around like 2.5, 3 Plato. But it will never go to 2 like a regular yeast would do. And then finally, so keep 2-3 days for diacetyl reduction, although it happens quite fast at such a low pH. So we've never seen any issues with diacetyl reduction. And then finally, to close off, I wanted to just explain a little bit about Belgian sour styles and what you can do with it. Maybe, I guess many of you know Belgian Geus and Lambic, or Belgian Kriek. So Kriek is actually derived from cherry, so this cherry used in the recipe. So this is a beer style that is made typically, oh, sorry, can you go one back? So this is a beer style that is typically made in the region of Brussels. So it happens in several phases. First, the wort is made and is put in a cool ship. So it's left open overnight to like airborne yeast and bacteria that fall into this wort and start to produce in a natural way lactic acid and acetic acid, and also these funky aromas like 4-EG, for instance, that is sometimes described as horse blanket. By the way, the crisp sour doesn't have these 4-EG flavors, so it will only produce lactic acid, so not the funky flavor. So this takes overnight. Then you have a primary fermentation, where your beer is fermented with natural biodiversity from the air. And then finally, at the end of this primary fermentation, cherries are added, and then the maturation happens in a cellar at lower temperature for several weeks to several months, with the addition of the cherries that give the typical flavor to the Kriek. So then, how could you, for instance, do the same? I just also wanted to mention that. So this is the old classical recipe for a Geus or a Lambic, but today many brewers they make a modern version. So when they have done the maturation with the cherries, they would add sugar, cherry juice, even cherry flavor to make it a very intense, almost like soft drink-like beer that tastes, that has a very intense cherry taste. So it still has the background of the spontaneous fermentation, but there is this flavoring on top, which makes it very accessible, much more accessible than a typical Geus or Lambic. So how could you do this in practice? For instance, with Pinnacle Crisp Sour. So typically we start from a wort 12 Plato, about 8 IBU, with 70% Pilsner malt and 30% raw wheat. So this raw wheat, it gives the haze in the recipe. And so these recipes typically are a little bit hazy. Then the bitter hops, they're often aged hops because it gives a specific flavor, or debittered hops. But essential is that the bitterness is low, because sourness and high bitterness, it becomes very harsh. So you need to keep the bitterness low. Pre-acidify to a pH 5, or even don't do it. It will work anyhow. And then ferment at Pinnacle Crisp Sour, 100 gram per hectoliter, ferment at 25 degrees. Then I would say just before the fermentation is finished, so let's say at a 4-5 Plato, then you add the fruit, and this can be cherry. It needs to be frozen or ruptured in a way so that the yeast can enter and the flavor can come out. At 10% of the volume, but you can also add any other fruits. So this is a recipe that will work with any fruits that you would like to try. So mature at 5 to 10 degrees for a number of weeks in maturation. So the yeast will also, if you keep it relatively high in temperature, not 2 degrees, but 5 or higher, then the yeast will also transform the glucosides in the fruit and unlock extra flavor. And then at the end, the pH will be somewhere 3.5. So then you get a nice smooth sour beer with some cherry flavor. If you want to have it really more intense and more closer to soft drink almost, then you can still add sugar, 1 Plato, cherry aroma, and even some colorant, like elderberry juice, which gives a very nice red color. And in this way, I think everyone could make in a relatively simple way, a beer like a fruited sour, or even a creek with a Pinnacle Crisp Sour. So I think, that was it. So thanks all for joining. We have a booth, number 44. Feel free to come by. We're close to our distributor, Cryer Malt. And if there are any questions, I'm very happy to take them.
We haven't got much time, but we've got a couple. Thanks for that, Ben. It's really interesting. So the first question from Matthew is, can you shed some light on the effect of yeast nutrients and ester production?
Yeah, it's typically known that the higher your free amino nitrogen is, the more ester production you get. So adding a nutrient that adds free amino nitrogen normally increases the ester production. But in my experience, the pitching rate and the temperature has still a higher impact. I think with the pitching rate you can have impact, and the temperature you can have impacts between 20 up to 50 or even 100%. But by adding a nutrient, maybe you're rather like 10-20% increase.
And just one final one. Andrew asked, do you find that you can direct the flavour between citrus versus tropical or berry flavours by altering the fermentation conditions?
So there are certain yeast-derived flavors that are in the range of citrus or tropical, but those are mostly not in such concentrations that I think you can really get it out of any yeast, especially those Californian ales. They don't make it. English ale also doesn't really have those tropical edges, I would say. I think then it comes more from the combination of hops and yeast. So combining the right hops with the right yeast, gives you a better chance to get out those tropical or citrus flavors. But it's definitely also part of the yeast that can enhance this. I think you've all seen the talks and so on thiols and glycosides. So this is where yeast has more impact on those flavors, but not really directly producing it.
Lovely. Well, thank you, Ben. That was really interesting. And stick around. In a minute, we're going to have Aussie Hops increasing capacity, improving quality and tackling selections with Owen Johnson from HPA. Thanks, everyone.